Ralston. I'm the co-founder and editor of Next Tribe. And every Thursday evening, we have some great author on to talk about her book or the process of writing. And this Thursday, we have Laurie Gwen Shapiro. She's well known throughout publishing, written for the New Yorker and every magazine known to womanhood. And she's a book author, and her latest book is The Stowaway, which is what we are going to be talking about today. And let me see why this, okay, yes. And we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about how at midlife she kind of changed her direction on what she was doing, and her journalism career and writing career. And she has a fabulous new book coming up that I can't wait to hear more about. And it's really exciting. We want the inside scoop, Laurie. So thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it's exciting. And thank you also to Dawn, who suggested this, for thinking of how can we as creatives also, it's not just about promoting yourself, but how can you share your experience? I mean, you're called Next Tribe, and I think there's I personally changed a lot of my philosophy as I got older, which is I used to think of everyone as competition. And now I feel that particularly creatives and women who are, just like we're all the same tribe, and you just really, I'm very open, and hopefully some of the hints I can give you will maybe get you through if you're a creative or stuck a little bit.
Well, and that's true. That's one thing I love about women in this age group. I feel like we are more sharing, and we want to help each other because we know what we are facing at this point. I mean, we don't have a lot of other people giving us hands up, so we need to help each other. And I love that attitude. And I know you're going to have a lot to share. We're all going to be thrilled to hear what you put into this book and how you got there. And also, I wanted to hear a little bit of reading. I mean, I listened to the book and just loved it. Was biking in Texas, listening and imagining cold, icy air, and loved it.
And actually, one of the things is that I hope to talk about how I went to Antarctica for 6 weeks. So that's part of my discussion as well.
Yes. And I do have your photos, so I can share those after you do your reading or while you're talking. I have some photos. But if you want to start with just a short reading so we can get into the spirit of it, that would be great.
Well, this is, just in case you don't know, The Stowaway came out in 2018 in hardcover and last year in paperback. And it was wasn't my first book, but it was my first nonfiction book. But I had written novels when I was much younger, sort of wacky novels, if you would like. This is a very different direction. And I am also a documentary maker. And so what you're hearing is nonfiction. It sounds like fiction, but it's very important that when you write a book as nonfiction, every single thing is true. So even if it's a sandwich, I have backup that's the kind of sandwich he was eating. So, and you need to know that if you ever write nonfiction. So I'm going to start with I'm going to skip a couple of paragraphs just to speed it up. But this is the prologue. Just to give you a little bit of background, this is 1928, but it says that in the prologue. So, and this is in New York City and by the Hudson River in Manhattan, downtown Manhattan. And with his back against the sunset, a 17-year-old boy lingered on the docks along the Hudson River. By his calculations, it was a 10-minute swim from where he stood to the ship. The new high school graduate waited, his soft gray eyes fixed on the city of New York. That's the ship name. I just added that. Moored and heavily guarded on the Hoboken piers. The sun went down at 6:45 this day, August 24th, 1928, but still he fought back his adrenaline. He wanted true darkness before carrying out his plan. At noon the next day, the ship would leave New York Harbor and sail 9,000 miles to the frozen continent of Antarctica, the last frontier on Earth left to explore. He intended to be aboard. That summer, baby-faced Billy Goronsky was 3 inches short of his eventual height of 5'11", and his voice still squeaked. "You are a late bloomer," his doting immigrant mother told him in thickly accented English. Yet the ambitious dreamer, born and raised in the gritty tenement streets of the Lower East Side, was as familiar with Commander Richard Evelyn Byrd's flagship as any reporter assigned to cover its launch. The Antarctica-bound bark was an old-fashioned multi-masted ship that suggested the previous century, with enchanting square sails arranged against an almost impenetrable maze of ropes. The 161-foot wooden vessel spanned half a city block, her 27-foot beam taller than a 3-story building. Sail and steam-powered, she had seen duty as an Arctic icebreaker for the Norwegian sail hunters in 1885. I'm going to skip a little bit because it's connected to the Titanic, that ship, but that's a digression. Several times in his mind that evening, Billy dove into the Hudson and started swimming, only to find his feet firmly on land. But he had been on board the SS New York before. 9 days earlier, he and 2,000 other New Yorkers had taken the 14th Street ferry to Hoboken, New Jersey, and gaped at the city of New York, moored next to the Grand Dutch ocean liners. The crowd was wowed with anticipation, and just past noon, the ship's captain, Frederick Melville, second cousin of 19th century author Herman Melville, gave the okay. Waving the first sweaty guests up the gangway, their dollar emission supporting Byrd's Antarctica Expedition's fundraising drive. And several members of Melville's crew, including the chief engineer, Thomas Mac Mulvoy, and 60-year-old veteran sailmaker, John Jacobson, joined him in greeting the adoring public. No, he told them, Byrd was not aboard, but everyone still wanted to gawk. And when it had been Billy Goronsky's turn to board, he wandered the wooden deck, still cargo-free, to accommodate guests. And what I go on here is how he picked out his spot before he swam over. And I'm going to just really skip forward in the prologue to the last 2 pages. In the rags to riches decade of the 1920s, everyone in the papers seemed to be living big, meaningful lives, from slugger Babe Ruth to fashionable Coco Chanel to comic genius Charlie Chaplin. Jews and blacks had broken through. The Marx Brothers achieved overnight fame after their Broadway debut, and provocative entertainer Josephine Baker packed them in Paris. New York City in 1928 was the rolling and dough town immortalized by F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose smash 1920 debut novel, This Side of Paradise, was assigned to English classes at Billy's alma mater, Manhattan's progressive textile high school. Adults, or at least city dwellers, were having a grand old time. Only the most sober investors knew that the stock market was not on a permanent high. Even once penniless immigrants were doing better for themselves. Billy knew he would inherit the one-man interior decorating business his father had established in New York as a destitute young man. But now that his boy would graduate in 4 short years from Cooper Union, a prestigious free college in Greenwich Village, Rudy Goronsky was ready to add "and son" to his sign. Billy's application to Cooper Union had been decent. He supposed he had a knack for art as well as history and languages, but who wanted to study history when you could make history? The thought of a humdrum future stuffing furniture mortified him. And here's the end of the prologue. By nearly 9 o'clock that August night, darkness draped the sky, and lights began to sparkle on the new downtown skyscrapers, young electric edifices from a decade of big money. From where he crouched, Billy could see the pyramid on top, the Bankers Trust Company building on Wall Street, the wedding cake-shaped 30-story Standard Oil building on Lower Broadway, the 40-story Ritz Tower on Park Avenue, and the first of the city's Art Deco towers, such as the New York Telephone Building on West Street, just completed months before. Great buildings that proved great things were possible. Billy stayed awake hours into the night, guessing and second-guessing the right moment to jump off the pier. Glory was not for the skittish, he told himself. Still, he was scared about low visibility under blackened skies, afraid that he might lose his way and drown, although he easily managed dozens of river swims with his athletic father and his downtown friends. But was anyone more determined than Billy to hitch a ride on the most famous rig in America? It was the bold, he was certain, who won the right to adventure. A few minutes past 4 in the morning, he had enough waiting. The young man took a breath and plunged.
Yay, we're all clapping virtually.
So as I said, that is not fiction. I know every single fact, and that's part of our discussion, I guess.
Yes, and I love how you paint the scene, you know, obviously with the buildings, that, you know, the books he would be reading in high school, and those, I mean, these little details just bring it to life. And I know each one of those details was hard won.
Yes.
So, and I'm curious why you started at that point. I went, and I've read about narrative nonfiction in books. I mean, I've written a memoir, which is different, but somebody said, start in the middle of the middle. I don't know. I don't know if that applies here, but it's such a great start.
Well, I mean, it's literally, he's taking it, well, I go back a little bit after that, but one thing I realized, I'm writing a biography here, or it's not really a biography, it's narrative nonfiction, which is slightly different, which we can talk about. But one thing I realized early on, I'm not writing about Abraham Lincoln. You know, I don't need to know the minutia of his, but I mean, this is not a 500-page book. This is a short, you know, 200, it's like 75,000 words. But what is the most interesting thing of this story? I am telling a story. I'm not writing a biography. That's narrative nonfiction. I don't know if everyone's familiar with Eric Larson or David Grann. This is like an Eric Larson type of story, not a biography, a traditional biography. So you start with what is interesting to people. I mean, I do go into a little bit of his later life. I did actually cut out, I hate to say this, I cut out 50,000 words in one hit because it was just not really what, at the end of his life, you know. But what was really interesting was, this is the first American expedition to Antarctica. And at one point, Admiral Byrd, who, you know, he became an admiral being in Antarctica, was the most famous man in America. And I'm not even making this up. 1927, there was he took a trip up to the North Pole from New York City. People don't know about the polar connection of New York City to the pole. And then there was some doubt about that. Because whether he actually really flew over, right away, people in the Explorers Club were doubting it. He didn't document it. So there was an idea that he would save his legacy in that was 1926. In 1927, he participated in the Orteig Prize, which was, as pretty much everyone who's history knows, was the flight across the Atlantic. And he was the shoo-in, and he had a problem with this plane, and a young gentleman named Charles Lindbergh won, and he became the most famous man in America. But these were icons, you know. In 1928, this whole trip was really conceived by Byrd as a way to secure his legacy. It did have positive effects, as you know, in history, and there is a legacy besides his own ego, but it really was conceived as a way to cement his place in time. And people don't remember Byrd, but what's crazy is that it's a big, complicated story. Everyone knew every name, but here's an easy way. We have someone who's an outsider literally jumping in the water, and we follow him to the Antarctica, and he's not an insider. And we can see this story in a very easy narrative to follow. And what was appealing to me too is that not only will adults love this book, I think, but it's a pretty clean story. I have to admit, I was, you know, I did maybe take out a couple of sentences when they were down in the, you know, Panama Canal, you know, I hinted at it, like, you know, I actually had more, I'll explain why I couldn't get too graphic, because I had a living person that was connected to the story. But, you know, I'm sure that all the sailors, when they were passing the Panama Canal, you know, had a little fun, if you know what I mean.
Well, I have to say that what is so great about what I love about narrative nonfiction, and you really capitalize on it, is that driving question, finding the spine, the question, and the question that drives throughout this is, does he make it there? Does he get there? Does he experience it the way? And I mean, there's just such a great natural.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is also, it's a story that starts in it also has a sense of place. Not only do you have Antarctica, but it also is a very New York story, and it's not just a New York story, it's a Lower East Side story. My family, I'm not Polish Catholic, I'm secular Jewish, but my family has been in the Lower East Side for 100 years. I know this area, and one of the things I remember, I think I might have spoken to you about this, but my high school English teacher downtown was Frank McCourt. And he would always say, start with what you know. And that's how I found the story, by starting in my own neighborhood. Things that you take for granted that people might know, they don't know. And starting local allowed me to expand not only my world, but my career as well. And that my old high school English teacher was always in my ear, like, look around with your neighborhood. And this story, I found it by looking around my neighborhood.
And should I just, a couple of things. One is, if you missed it before, I'd like to see if people could write their questions. If you have a question, write it in chat, and then I will unmute you. You can talk to Laurie directly about that. But I also want to show you, Laurie has some great photos that I think just add so much. And I'm going to share my screen so you can see more technology. Let's see here, share, yep, there you go. Okay, now it's not going. Sorry. Okay, see it now?
Oh, actually, this is St. Mark's Place. This is with the house that he lived in, which was the East Village. If everyone has been to New York or you haven't been, the Lower East Side used to be much larger. This was a tenement building that was where it still exists, where he lived. It's not quite a tenement rent now. I would imagine a 2-bedroom apartment would be $4,000 to $5,000 a month rental.
It's nice. It's really nice.
But it's really like in the middle of the Lower East Side back then, and it's still there. It's really nice. This is I went
backwards.
Oh, that's okay. There is the young boy in the sailor cap is Billy Goronsky. He's Polish Catholic. He went back to Poland. The family was very proud of their Polish heritage. This is his father, Rudy Goronsky, and that's his mother, Fromia, who became Francesca here. She was a very thin, shapely woman, and he was bringing her over, and there was this whole, I found all these romantic postcards. There was a lot of fighting when she got here, and she became involved with the women's suffragette movement. But there he is, Billy, as a young boy on the beach. And I can wonder if you can imagine that. I don't know how many people know New York, but this is a Lower East Side immigrant kid. So they took the F train to this beach. This is Coney Island over there. But he loved the ocean, and he apparently never got out of that sailor suit for about 2 years. He had that trip back to Poland, and I would love to. Oh, what a picture would you like?
Which one do you want?
The next one. Okay, this is the city of New York without its mask, but this was selected by Bird. Bird's trip was really one of the first great PR moves. It was, again, to cement his reputation. And he worked with a gentleman who was Sigmund Freud's nephew, who's been called the founder of PR. And so they purposely chose a ship from the 1800s to kind of get that romantic feeling. It was an old Norwegian ship. They renamed it the City of New York to get all of New York City emotionally connected to it. And this is parked on the Hudson River before it's going out to Antarctica. You can see, if you look to the bottom right, you could see a little bit of the Empire State Building. That's how you know it's in New York still.
That was being constructed at the time.
Yeah, and just so you know, there were 4 ships that were going to Antarctica. And this was without giving too much of the story away, this was the first ship Billy tried to stow away on. There was a lot of stowing away attempts, and his legend grew in New York City. He eventually became known as the Stowaway Kid.
Yes, and I'm going to just look for a picture of him as an older guy. Wait, am I?
Well, go back. Oh, this was a competition. He had a teen rival on this trip who was, one of the ways Bird thought that he could get everyone interested is to get teenagers interested. And teenagers still love this book. This is a very popular book as well as adults. And the story is really appealing. And so they had 600,000 Boy Scouts apply. And these were the 6 finalists. And they were interviewed and selected. And Franklin Roosevelt helped narrow them down. And one of them went on to become the official Boy Scout, and he was very upset that there was a stowaway who was getting some of his publicity.
Which one is he? The one, the Seipel.
Paul Seipel. He's right in the middle on the bottom.
Oh yeah,
he's a ringer. He had 57 badges, and he was already about 20 years old. So I don't know how much of a boy he is, but he was in some ways, he was quite dull. But in other ways, he ended up being not such a bad choice. If you ever say the word wind chill factor, we have Paul Seipel to thank for it. He went on to become one of the great figures in American Antarctica history. But Billy was everyone's favorite on this trip because when he eventually got a long way in, got into this trip, he was playing poker with people. He was from New York City. He had flapper girlfriends and bohemian girlfriends. And, he was hip. He went to school where art school, they had nude drawing. My mother went to this art school. She had the same principal as he had. They had nude drawing classes in the 1920s, and they were reading F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I was able to also get the curriculum for the school from that year. So that was how I was in it, to see what you had to take to graduate.
And one question, I think I just want to show a picture of him at the age when he was on the boat, and then but do I keep going forward, or did I miss it?
Maybe you go down on this, on the arrow key. I think this is a cat named Eleanor that actually, I just loved this cat because it was like, it crept on in New York City, went to Antarctica and came back and was in the ticker tape parade. It's the only cat that I know in American history that went to the Antarctic. That was my editor, and I had a funny joke. She's like, enough with the cats. I was like, no, I got to put a cat in.
Am I missing him? No, there he is. Here's this.
Oh, here we go. And this is a key picture because here you have Billy around the time that I guess he's a year older. He's a little bit taller, but this is on the right, you see speeches. Now, he became very valuable to the trip because he became a crowd favorite. And he did a lot of radio appearances. This was a very important expedition because it was the first time radio was used. If you think about the golden age of exploration for Antarctica, Robert Scott, Shackleton, that's about 10 years earlier. All of America was listening to these trips, and they set up a radio station on ice in what the town they called Little America. And the Stowaway would give his report. And one of the places that also he spoke with when he came back for a short visit was WOR radio in New York, which still exists. It's talk radio, and it was so powerful. It had millions of listeners. And I didn't have the recording. That never doesn't exist. But I was able, and I will talk about that if you like, how I found all this information. This was his speech. So that's in the speech. It says how he did it, what time he went out, what he was eating on the radio. He also gave a speech to his high school class. His history, he was in the history club, and he came back as he dreamed making history.
Yes, I love that. I love that. So
perhaps I can tell you about how I found the story because I think people really love that story.
I want to definitely hear that. So yes, please. And then we have some questions coming in.
Sure. Well, one of the things, as I said, this is also talking about how I changed careers. I was in a writing rut when I was very lucky to be published when I was very young, in my mid-20s, late 20s, by Algonquin, and I had a novel, a funny novel called The Unexpected Salami. That was serious, its title. And Anthony Bourdain, an unknown Anthony Bourdain, reviewed it in the New York Times, and it was just a little hit. Like, I got a film deal, it didn't get made, but you know, it did really. But then I was too young to really understand the industry. And I was funny. It's not funny to say you're funny, but I was funny. And inherently unfunny. But I was pushed into what was a very lucrative career back then, which was chick lit, which was not what I wanted to do. I was writing a literary light fiction, but you could just, as a young woman, you could just get these book deals. And it was really the end of what I thought was my literary shot. And I had always wanted to be a writer. Concurrently, I was a filmmaker doing documentaries and doing these big narrative stories. And I was in a rut, and I thought, what if I can combine my filmmaking skills with these big stories and my novel skills, like telling a story and allowing for dialogue. A lot of people who write biography don't realize you can very definitely put dialogue in biography or nonfiction, as long as there's a source. If there was a printed interview, or if you have a radio interview, you can put dialogue in, pop narrative. But I didn't know where to begin. And I had an agent who I was a very nice person. I mean, but at the same time, I had left my big agent and done this chick lit career. And it would have been very easy for me to sell what you call a mid-list book, where you didn't really sell a lot of copies, but you didn't sell a little copies. And that's not the vision I had for myself. I wanted to tell a big story. I read the New Yorker. I wanted to write like the New Yorker, but I'm already at this point in my late 40s. How do you do that? How, have I missed the boat? And I was talking to my agent, and she said, well, that's not who you are. You don't write for the New Yorker. You could do this funny. And I just thought, no, that is who I am. And I will say that the main person that believed in me at this point was me. My daughter is lovely, my husband is lovely, but they're like, why don't you just do a good PR job, make film, and documentaries are wonderful. You get a lot of perks, but you have to pay a lot of people. So even though I've had films that have been on HBO and have won awards, at the end of the day, I maybe could buy sushi at the end. And so the idea was basically, I want to get paid for my work too. And I also, as you might have heard me just say, I have a now 17-year-old daughter. I have college coming up. I need to, why should I not get paid at the level of my experience? I've been writing now since I'm 53, just to be on the official record. I've been writing books since my late 20s. I have this experience. And I met a wonderful agent who said, I don't even know what book you are going to write, but I see your passion and I'm going to sign you up and you'll know it. But the way you should do it is start practicing on writing a couple of nonfiction pieces, just so I can show editors that you can do nonfiction. So I would do stories, and this is a really big tip I would like to give you, is a lot of people say, oh, you need to get paid for what you're writing. Yes and no, because my goal was not to be writing small journalism pieces. My goal was to do a nonfiction book where I knew the money was. But what I needed was clips. So I was able to do small stories and start to get clips. And this story began as I was just going to do a story about this Polish Catholic church in the Lower East Side. That's the oldest Polish Catholic church in the United States. And just this little story. And I met with the priest. It was a little bit like the Thornbirds, who's gorgeous. I don't know if anyone's ever read He didn't know the story of the church. And I started to dig. This is day 2. I was getting $200 for this. This was like not really the New York Times. It was like a blog for the East Village that you got NewYorkTimes.com, but it was like, all right, that's good enough. I can use that as a clip. And I started to look up the history of this church. And within a few minutes, there was a thing about 1928, the Polish stowaway kid who was like swam across the Hudson River and got to Antarctica. I was like, what? And I just stopped the blog. I called my agent. I said, I found it, but how do you get access to the story? This is if you look in any stories from the day, he's like a little mention. And I realized, all right, his name is, you have to start thinking out of the box. First thing is his name is Goronsky. That's a long name. People were not good with ethnic names. I started to put a few other names in different spellings. More stories started to pop up, but it was still not enough to get a book deal. And I wanted, as a documentary maker, I used this skill. I want to get someone who is direct access. When you get paid for a film on a documentary, if you have access, it doesn't matter how famous you are. I needed access to the story, emotional access. So I seriously made a long list of every Goronsky on the East Coast. I figured if he went to Antarctica, he must live near the river. You know, dopey as that. And I just started calling people, made a spreadsheet, and I said, hi, are you possibly related to this kid named Billy Goronsky who swam, you know, click. And it's in the other room, number 16, I did the call. An older woman answered the phone, and she had a Polish accent, and Billy was born in Manhattan, so I thought, this can't be her kid. I was about to get off the phone, and she said, that was my husband. Oh. And I had this Titanic moment. And had a chill, a real chill. I knew, I just said, that's it. And she said, if you can come to my house, I live in Maine on the coast. I have all these materials. I was married to him, and he was, remember, the youngest member, and this was his second wife. Hooray for second wives, because she was 20 years younger than him, and that's part of the story too. So that's why she was alive. By the way, Gisela, who I knew very well, got tremendous access from, and where I got so much of this information, has passed away. And if I hadn't made that access, this story would have just vanished into thin air. And I was able to interview her, and then, without giving away too much more, I was able to find other unexpected sources. So now she had a scrapbook. And one hint I can give you for nonfiction is that you can do, even on lockdown, you can get into a lot of archival sources that are amazing. A lot of places have opened up their archives, like JSTOR, which is usually very expensive. New York Public Library, your card will get you in for free, and you can use newspapers.com, which is a great source. But there were dozens of papers in the 20s and the 30s, and many of them have not been archived. And here comes a scrapbook. Oh. Now I have a wife. If a lawyer asked me, where's your source? I'm like, well, his wife, this is his wife. You know, how did he feel? Well, he told his wife. You know, I have an audio recording for backup of her. I have, you know, his speeches. I started to build a story, but the most important thing for me at all times was not to fall into the trap of writing a biography, because that is not what I wanted to write. That is a different type of book. This is narrative nonfiction. I wanted, and that's, by the way, for women, especially mid-career women, who people don't want to take a chance on, by the way, for the most part. That is your secret pathway into the publishing industry. Because if you get that access that no one else has, it doesn't matter if you're famous, if you're middle-aged, if you're young or whatever, you're going to get paid for it. Because access pays. And that's a filmmaking lesson that I brought to my career.
And just to be clear, how do you separate then narrative nonfiction and biography? Let's draw the line.
Well, for example, there's also you could say that this is also Stowaway is also a slice of life biography. You could call it that if you want to not call it narrative. Now, the most famous one, if you saw the Lincoln movie, which is, with Daniel Day-Lewis, that's not the whole story of Lincoln. That's just a little slice of history that is fascinating. So for me, the slice of history, I do go a little bit in his background, and I do go to the end because you have to do that. But the real slice of history is 1928 to 1930. And that's an extraordinary time in American history. And I have a 17-year-old protagonist. So what happens in 1928 is it's Great Gatsby, New York. They're on ice when the Depression hits. So this crew, everyone on the crew was as famous as any baseball team. When they came back, America it was the end of the 20s. So his story, if you look at that little slice of time, can not only tell the story of the Stowaway and tell this Antarctica expedition, but can also tell a very not told history of the end of the 20s, that transition from to the people know about the Great Depression, but they don't know about that transition. And that's what I was looking for in a story, was something that could really hit like a time, a place. And I think that's something that if you're looking at your own stories and you think, okay, people have written about this, but what can I get access to that nobody else has written about? And we'll talk about this later, but I recently got a book deal. I switched publishers. I'm going to be with Viking after the COVID crisis, I hope. It's 2022, a book about Amelia Earhart. And how dare I write about Amelia Earhart? I'm not a pilot, but I got a story that hasn't been told. And I got special access to it by looking for access. And that's how you get a book deal in the high end of book deals.
I can't wait to hear about that. But we do have some questions, and I want to get about the Stowaway.
Sure.
I want to get to Kim Kankowitz. Am I saying it correctly? How do you say it?
You got it. Thanks. So my question, you touch on this a little bit since I put the question in, but I'm wondering if you can talk about kind of two related things. First of all, strategies for filling in gaps in the narrative if you don't have documented information, and then also just getting those internal feelings and thoughts of your character. So you did say that you had his wife to talk to, so you kind of answered that, but I also wonder if there are other strategies for sort of writing around, what they might have been feeling, or so those two questions were.
Well, one of the things that you can look for, I'm writing two different types of nonfiction books. This book was an unknown person, and Amelia Earhart is someone that's so known. How do you get something new? And so there's two different types of books. But with an unknown person, I was able to determine his high school. I was able to get his high school yearbook. I was able to see who's writing in his yearbook. What are the people, like who he went to the prom with, what clubs he was in. You start to understand who this person is. I was able to get his transcripts. His, what he was not going to school all the time. Because he was always, but he was smart. Like he spoke seven. I knew that he spoke 7 languages from his wife. And my daughter is, I'm the worst, but my daughter just speaks languages like that. So I could see that kind of, the other thing is, as a woman, I am telling an Antarctica story here, and almost every Antarctica story, anything about the mom is immediately cut out. But if you think about this, the mother becomes a very important character too, because this is her. Imagine, I don't know how many of you have a teenager, or imagine if your kid swam into the Hudson River and was headed to Antarctica. You'd freak out. This is like the end of his prom and his high school graduation, and so the mother becomes important, the prom becomes important. Those are things that a man would not put in an Antarctica book, and gives it more of an emotional connection to the story. And I would also ask you, as anyone who's considering this, is what do you bring to the story from your own personal connection? I'm a mom. I bring my motherhood to, we're telling an Antarctica story. How can that be used to get that? I understand my daughter, who is doing great now, but she had a rebellious 17-year-old year to end all years, I got it. Like, I get that. The fear and, there's sort of a loathing of your parents at the same time that there's love. Those are emotional aspects that you can bring in the story. Look for your own personal connections to the story. Another connection, as I said, is I grew up in New York City. My family's from here. I really I walk the streets of New York all the time, even now with a mask on. And I don't go on the parks. It's crazy out there. But I know the streets well. I know, so I can bring that emotional connection. For example, I was saying that I wrote about, I lived in Austin for a year, but I don't really know Austin. Like, I was living it would be difficult for me. I already have as Frank McCourt said, you already have a PhD in your neighborhood. I already know the Lower East Side like the back of my hand. And I know the history for how, my family's from here. So I'm already with a running start by choosing a story that began in my neighborhood.
That's great. Good advice. I like your PhD in your neighborhood. So we have another question from Etta. Etta, are you there?
I'm here.
Did you some of the things she's talked about, but
yeah, you've already answered my question, Laurie. It was similar to Kim's question. Especially the passage that you started with, giving Billy's thoughts before he dove in the water. But you've already addressed that. He must bring those up in the speech that he gave.
He talks about it, and also there were a lot of, once it was really hard to find articles about him because people were spelling his name wrong. Sometimes it's as simple as that. His name is Goronsky. Bird misspelled it, and nobody spelled a Polish name right. I only had 3 articles in the beginning. By the end, I had over 160 articles. Wow. And they interviewed him. And one of the greatest pieces I got was a piece from an unknown reporter in Hampton Roads, Virginia, who actually spoke to him and his dad and his mother. And then I found, for example, I started to do a deep dive on records. I found that he was, his father popped up because he had a speeding record in his Model A. And his excuse at the magistrate, was, well, my son just stowed away to Antarctica. My wife was very upset. And that's in the paper. So, like, what was their mental state is, not only is that a little anecdote you can slip into the story, but you kind of know that they're yelling at each other because he tells the judge, so you can have a little liberty, but you can't take a lot of liberty, if that makes any sense. And also, anytime anyone's been interviewed, like Amelia Earhart, for example, which we'll talk about later, she gives a very polished interview. She's a much harder challenge for me than the Stowaway, who's 17 and untrained with media and is just speaking his mind. Amelia Earhart, like, are you really getting into her emotional center when you read a very highly crafted, article that her husband, who's a PR guy, is crafting?
So yeah, let's talk about that book, because I'm so excited. It made a big splash, right? And you got lots of people bidding for it.
It was exciting.
And
Fortunately, before the COVID crisis. So.
So, and what stage are you in with that now?
Well, one of the things I would suggest to anyone doing research is that most people the beauty of writing a nonfiction book is that you get money to start. You don't have to write the whole book. You can write an outline. All agents are different. Some will say, my first book, The Stowaway, was 1 chapter, a very short chapter, and one, like a basic, her outline idea was 8 pages. Amelia Earhart was a 75-page kind of narrative of, like, not telling the story, but this is where I'm going with it. So each agent is different, but that took me a couple of months to write that. But then I have money to write and really do the deep dive. One of the first things I did, because I've now gone through the experience of writing this, is that time goes fast. teenagers freak out. My father, I had a very elderly dad who passed away in January. He got sick. He was 99 years old. I mean, like, there was things happening around, my writing this, but I knew what I needed to do the second I got a contract was do my deeper dive research. And I did the boring research first. I wouldn't say boring, but I love to travel. I love putting places into my narrative. Like as I said, I went to Antarctica, which we can talk about, but I went to libraries. You got to get them done. You can't not do it. You cannot write a book about Amelia Earhart and not spend, there's 3 or 4 places where the main archives are, and they're in the middle of Indiana. And I went up to, I was in Indiana for a week. But I got that done right away. So when everything hit, even though I still have more research to do and I'm able to do workarounds, I have my recorded, I interviewed people there, I did my research there, I did copies. So there is something in the bank. I have a very short period of time. People think I'm a fast writer, so I which is good and bad, because they gave me I have to hand in my book next May, and I have, as of May 1st this year, I'm sticking to my schedule. It's a very depressing time, but I have my little schedule. My schedule is stop researching. I had it all over my computer. Stop researching. You got to start writing. At a certain point, you have to let go and start writing. And so I have a year to write it.
Is that because then you'll see what more research you need gaps filled in, or that?
Yeah, but at a certain point, I was actually just at a very interesting, Eric Larson's book, which I think is #1 in the United States right now, about Winston Churchill, just came out. I was able to go to one of his only readings in person, and then I actually did see him on a webinar similar to this, and he talked about, how do you write about Winston Churchill? He didn't realize until when he started how many people had written about him. But at a certain point, you have to have your own archives that are important to you. I have about 20 aspects of the story that no one's ever told with me, and what I'm doing is I'm writing those scenes first, because I want to make sure they're in there. And then, but I'm also not trying to tell the story of Amelia Earhart. And I think the biggest thing about this book is that I'm not trying to tell you how, I have my thoughts, but my book is not what a lot of men write books about, where Amelia Earhart's plane is. And they don't really care about her as a woman. And I realized, I don't know who Amelia Earhart is. I know we know Amelia Earhart, the icon. And I told people my elevator pitch was, I'm not writing about Amelia Earhart dead. I'm writing about how she lived. And everybody's eyes just opened up, because what do you really know about Amelia Earhart? Was she a really good flyer? Is that true? Was she straight? Was she bisexual? Was she lesbian? Do you know what she was? She was married. Was that her real love affair? So there's all sorts of interesting aspects of Amelia Earhart. And then, because I knew what I wanted, I started to look in areas that I could maybe get my own. I can't give it away yet, because I have to read, I don't know who's tuning in, but I was able to then increase my access to the point where I put it into my proposal. And I also did some interviews with people that no one's ever interviewed. Obviously, this is, Amelia Earhart is not alive to tell her own story. So there's always going to be people that are going to challenge it. But again, the other thing that really hit me is she's a wife. I've met my husband when I was 21. I've known him for 30 years. That's a long-term marriage. Are marriages perfect? Are you in business relationship? Are they love? Or both? I don't see men writing this book. I see men wanting to get credit for where they're figured out that their plane went down. I don't care where her plane, I do care, but I care about her as a person. And that was the passion that I was able to tell editors. And they were like, yeah, I don't know anything about Amelia Earhart. I know her trips, but I don't know who she was as a person. So that was another way I also use a phrase, talked about Eric Larson before. Some of my favorite authors are like Eric Larson, David Gran. I don't know if you know David Gran, who has Killers of the Flower Moon and The Lost City Z. These are also New Yorker type writers that are telling a story. And in my pitch sessions, I said, well, no one's ever Eric Larson's Amelia Earhart. The last biography, if you look, you're like, how many books are there? There are a lot of books about it. But the last big biography, it's important. It was like in 1997. There was one from the 80s, but that's it. The rest of them, I'm like, but no one's ever told a narrative nonfiction story about Amelia Earhart. And that's an opportunity, I think, for all of us that are writers, is if that kind of storytelling interests you, if you're a good storyteller, you can look back at history that we already know and tell it. I mean, I always think about how many people have read Unbroken by Laura Hillebrand. I mean, he actually told that story himself. He was a very religious man, and he was a lovely person, and he wasn't the most fabulous writer, but that story was already in print, but she retold the story. And even when she got to the part of him finding Billy Graham, I mean, he was, as you may have known, he was a runner, he was in the Olympics, and then he was shot down in World War II and held prisoner. And Angelina Jolie made this into a movie as well. That story just was told by him. How do you improve it? Because he was a terrific guy, but not a great storyteller. If storytelling is your strength, and this is where my novel background, I know how to tell a story. I wrote novels, I made documentaries. I realized that I can tell a story of Amelia Earhart. Going to be different than anyone who's trying to get every factoid in. I'm trying to get factoids away from me. I mean, like, there's too much written about her. I could drown in my research. So it's really important, as I said, to stop your research at a certain point and trust what you have and trust what you think the story is. Build your own archive.
We have a couple more questions, but did you consider doing a novelization? I mean, there's a lot of that too, a novelization of.
I have to say, I've switched also to journalism. And I love it. I mean, I love nonfiction, and I love that truth is stranger than fiction. But I don't know how many women are listening to this tonight, but again, I'm pretty late in the game to be having a nonfiction career. But the positive part of nonfiction is that you can get real access to the story, and you can get the big bucks. And that is something that women need to know, that by telling a story that no one else can tell, it doesn't matter how old you are. You're already getting that I see a lot of women given a chance. I mean, I was given a chance. I was kind of sort of a Semitic, like Jackie O looking person in my 20s. Like I was a wacky kid. I was given a chance when I maybe shouldn't have been given a chance when I was 28, It was part of it was I was bubbly and, but what I'm saying is that a lot of people are, if you don't think that looks and age counts, that's not a reality check. A good novel will always sell itself. If you're a really good writer, people don't want to bring down your career. They want to push it. But there is still ageism. The acquiring editors are often very young. But what really gives you that advantage as a middle-aged woman, in my opinion, is really having a story that no one else can tell, because I got it. Yeah, you want that story? I got that story. You got to pay me for that story.
Well, we have a question from Laurie Weintraub. Laurie, do you want to ask?
Oh,
Sure. Hi, Laurie. How are you?
we went to high school together.
So I'm curious about the writing process and how you pace yourself, and do you work in one sitting? Do you break up your day? Do you?
Right.
You talked a little bit about jumping around in the book and writing key scenes first, but if you could just talk a little bit about how you work on a daily basis.
Sure. How many people know the writer Abigail Thomas? Does anyone ever hear? She writes memoirs. She was one of my writing teachers as well. I was at a workshop with her in her home. Wasn't even it was after, but in my 20s. And she really gave me a method that I use, which is just try to write 2 pages a day. And it really makes writing into a non-threatening unit. I tend to write 2 pages a day, even when it's not a pandemic. And if I get my 2 pages done in 2 hours, I'm good. I'm like, yeah, I can be on Facebook. I can walk. If sometimes it's set, 5 hours. But imagine, like, it allows you to, like, if you did that for 365 days, you'd have way too much writing, but that allows you to have days when you're just falling apart, for whatever reason. But I basically keep to that. The other thing that I try to do is I know that I don't really concentrate past 4 hours. So my basic writing unit is a 4-hour block, sometimes 5 hours. When I get down to the nitty gritty, when I'm really into rewrite and there's a deadline, I can go really many more hours. But for the most part, I mean, it's difficult, especially I'm a mom. Like, I mean, dealing with I was a sandwich generation. Is anyone here a sandwich generation person where you have a teenager and a 99-year-old dad who's living with me in my house, who's handicapped? It was insane. How are you going to write for 8 hours a day? That's not on. What did happen for me is that I know one other person I could see on the screen has this. We were able to get this wonderful library fellowship where we got our own room and access for free for this year. And I was in the middle of getting this great routine down when the pandemic hit. But one other thing that has really helped me, and this will help somebody, is that you can go online, see or find books that have written about your subject. Check the bibliography, start checking online, and write down these sources, and then you can find them on eBay really cheaply. Like, for example, when I was reading about the Stowaway, nobody cared about Antarctica from 1930. I had one of the biggest Antarctica book collections you've ever seen. I got most of my books for like $3, $4. I had my own library. So I started to put some of my advance money, it's not that much, but like building my own Amelia Earhart library. I should probably show a picture later. I have 3 bookcases of Amelia Earhart books. I mean, I don't think all of them are great. I mean, there's a lot of wackadoodle stuff, but I also look to see other people's bibliographies. You can buy those magazines, you can find them online. Often you can go on Google Books and find a version of it, or you can find it sometimes if it's out of copyright, but you could buy the magazine. I often bought a magazine for $5 and it's the exact magazine that was somebody else was looking for. I do not want to quote another writer's words. And the danger with using previous biographies of Amelia Earhart as my source material is that I'm going to mimic, their words, their style, their rhythm. What I'm doing is going back to the original source material that they were looking at and putting away their book and looking at it with my eyes. And that's a really important reason why I went to all the libraries as well, was because I don't want to hear what someone else said is in that library in Indiana. I needed to look through it. And also the librarians themselves are the unsung heroes. One woman I just interviewed by FaceTime, because that's the new, Zoom and FaceTime. I'm doing my interviews. I did most of my interviews. There were about 3 or 4 that I didn't do, and I've done them on FaceTime or Zoom. Happy to be interviewed. Everybody's working. A lot of people are working. They're happy to get, please, I want to prove that my job is needed. I had the head of the Air and Space Museum, who specializes in women's aviation, on the phone on FaceTime with me for 3 hours. And we were really talking about Amelia Earhart. And one of the things that was so fascinating was that she brings her own information that's not in any archive. The librarians themselves are often a phenomenal source of information, and they're often women. They're often quiet. They're often like in their 40s, their 50s, their 60s. And people come in and they're invisible to visitors. And that's often the person you really need to seek out right away, is the elder librarian that's been in the collection for years and thrilled to help you. I've never had anyone who's not been thrilled. In fact, the bird librarian is one of my good friends. She's in Ohio, where there's hardly anyone goes in there because it's the size of a football field, because Bird thought that he would be so famous. He said he had 4 expeditions to Antarctica. She had a forklift to get the papers out. But like, I mean, how many visitors are going to the Bird Antarctica library every year? So she was thrilled, and she invited me out to Ohio when the book came out. I was on Ohio radio on NPR, and we had 1,000 people coming out from, it was exciting for them. It's a local story. So enlist your librarians as a secret source.
We're about to run out of time, but I want to get to Elizabeth DeWolf to talk about your social media, because you're famous for that, aren't you?
Well, one thing I do know is you have to be authentic. I like to talk, as you can see. I like people. I'm a bit of a loner in surprising ways. Like, I like to walk around and observe. I'm not really in the center of the party. I'm watching the party, if that makes any sense. But
do you have a specific question about it, or I wanted to?
Oh, yeah, I was just curious, Laurie, about your goals for using social media, and if you have any kind of guiding principles, because your Facebook feed is, as you've just said, so personal, but it's also funny and informative. And thank you, by the way, for the tip about economy candy. My box should arrive tomorrow. So I was just curious about, in your mind, how do you approach social media, both as a woman and as an author?
Okay, I think one thing is, I went to a film conference once early on when Facebook was kind of on a newish side, and they thought that Facebook might dominate for a few more years. And they said, if this guy was saying, if you're a comedian, tell jokes on Twitter or Facebook, brand yourself. If you're a musician, put music on, but don't just talk about yourself. Share other people's work. I make it a real point to share people's work. I particularly share women's work. I find that young people will share a lot of the same, their pals. I find that it's harder for women who are a little, not older, but middle-aged, to get people to be excited. I make it a point to share other people's, not just myself. But what is my brand? To me, my brand, if you want to say, is a storyteller. So my Twitter account is called Laurie Stories. My Instagram, I use Instagram mostly to stalk my teenager, but but Facebook, even though it's not hip, Facebook has unfortunately it still has a very deep storytelling aspect to it. You can go longer, and it has a very deep reach. Twitter is really good to follow other authors and to get connections with people, but and Instagram is I know that people who have stores or are artists use Instagram to a great effect, but it's a little bit more difficult when you're selling stories, when you're telling, and Facebook, as if you haven't, my daughter says it's no one's on Facebook. You're on, but it's there are a lot of people on Facebook, whether anyone says it or not. And I also, if I'm in it, I'm in it. I post a lot, and my content is good. I think, maybe it's not, but I try to put stories and articles. I'm also a journalist. I'm also working on a story right now for my 3rd article. I remember my agent when I said I wanted to write for the New Yorker, and she said, that's not what you do. And I found a new agent. I'm on my 3rd article for the New Yorker that I'm working on right now. And the story got shut down because the story's still on, but it's a real-time story, and that's on hold. But I also shared articles, not just books. I'm a storyteller. I look for great stories that are out there, and I love to read. I don't know what everyone else's passion is, but I figure that my tribe is going to find me. I'm going to find the people that are literary or who love journalism. And they do. I mean, Elizabeth is someone who I met through social media. We met in real time in New York. And her husband was actually helping me on a story that I was working on. So for an article. So, I mean, you just, also that's another thing is if you have, a lot of people are on these secret, not so secret groups for women writers that are on Facebook and, you know, like connect to people. When I go to Indiana, I looked up, there were about 5 people in Indiana that were my Facebook friends. I asked people online, are you friends with anyone that's worth interesting? I had got more friends there. I have friends now all over the United States from where I'm researching. And partly because I don't let everyone be my friend on social media, but if you have a few friends in common and as a nice message, sure, why not? And some of my real nice friends that I've made in the last few years have come from just trusting myself. I mean, if somebody's a little creepy, you immediately kind of just get rid of them, you know? But that's only happened once or twice, to be honest. I mean, I've had a very good luck with social media.
Well, we had Julie Murphy said how much she loves your Facebook feed. So thank you, Julie.
Oh, Julie is from the Mariners Museum, and she got this amazing crowd. She's just, if anyone has a sea-related story, you've got to look up. That's the most incredible museum in Virginia, in Hampton Roads.
Oh, cool, great. Well, we're a little over time, but it was so worth it. I mean, I feel like we had so much more we could talk about, right? I mean,
yeah. And I will say that I'll give people, if you want to email me, lgsnyc@gmail.com.
did everybody get that?
And if you have a personal question, again, very important to me is not, I used to be secretive. I'm no gatekeeper. That is not my job. I'm someone who's very embracing. I'm also, tell you the truth, if I think your story is not, you know, ready, you got to have somebody who can tell you the truth. But if there's no reason to keep somebody who's got an incredible story from getting connected to other people. Everybody loves to do that. Yeah. And I think it's really important for all of us to look at, especially if you're a woman and you're over 40, that, hey, we're all on the same team. It's really hard. Let's do it together.
Yes, it is. So, and what I'll do is I'm going to email, we recorded this, we're going to post it after the recording, and then I'll send you an email, everybody, so you can see it, and it'll have some information such as your email address, if that's okay. And so we can,
or LaurieGwenShapiro.com is another way to reach me.
Yeah, you can find. So we thank you so much, Laurie Gwen.
Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful time, and so inspiring and so informative about the writing process and the research. And I mean, I've got a lot out of it, and I'm sure others.
I hope people got it. Just remember, if you take one word away from this, is access.
Okay.
Access equals money.
I like that formula. Thank you to everyone who showed up, and I hope you'll come to another. We do, Next Tribe does all kinds of virtual events, from yoga. Dawn does her yoga nidra. Kim Seiler does meridian yoga and vinyasa. We have cooking demonstrations. We have all kinds of great things. Our mission is to inform, promote, and connect women, smart, engaged women over 45. So if that's you, please look us up.
Okay. Lovely to see everybody's faces too, and I hope there's some FaceTime, Facebook people that are watching.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.